Hi, everyone. Welcome. Excited to have you join us tonight for a great presentation. My name is Emma. I use she, her pronouns. I am the campaign organizer with our Sierra Club Iowa Beyond Coal campaign here in Iowa, based in Des Moines. Super excited to have Peter Goode here with us, environmental engineer at the Washington University Interdisciplinary Environmental Clinic down in St. Louis. We are really grateful to partner with them. We've been working on this coal ash research for about a year now, and have just had a great partnership and great research that's come of this. So yeah, really excited to have Peter here to speak with us tonight. We were going to have Tara as well, but she had something come up, but I trust Peter has a great presentation ready for us. So thank you again for joining. We are recording this webinar, so it will be accessible later, and we'll put it on the YouTube page. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A as we go throughout, and I will flag them for Peter. And we might have a little bit, hopefully we'll have some time at the end for Q&A as well. So thank you again for joining. And Peter, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Emma. Like Emma said, my name is Peter Goode. I'm an environmental engineer at the Washington University Interdisciplinary Environmental Clinic. And just a little bit about what our clinic is and what we do. We're actually an experiential learning class based in the law school at Washington University. But we're unique in that we have both law students that work in our clinic as well as undergraduates who are specializing in environmental studies and also engineering and some other sciences as well too. So we bring these students together to work on projects and cases for real clients like the Sierra Club. Um, and over the past, I don't know, 15 years or so, we've done a lot of work related to coal ash, especially in the state of Missouri and somewhat on the national level. And we had done a lot of work analyzing coal ash at the various coal-fired power plants in Missouri. Missouri is one of the most coal-dependent states in the country. We usually fall behind Texas and occasionally behind Ohio, so we're usually number two or three in coal consumption in the country. So we've had a lot of work to do here on behalf of the Missouri chapter of the Sierra Club. And a little over a year ago, we were asked by the Iowa chapter if we could do some similar work in Iowa to what we had done um, in Missouri. And they asked us to look at a number of coal-fired power plants in Iowa and the coal ash disposal methods and environmental impacts around those coal-fired power plants. So we did that and we produced a number of fact sheets. And on today, I'm going to be presenting on what we did and kind of what we found. And I'm going to start off by talking a little bit. I'm sure a lot of you know what coal ash is, but just so we're all kind of working from the same baseline, I wanted to give a little bit of a primer on what coal ash is. And it's kind of what it sounds like. It's a byproduct of burning various types of coal, and there are several types of coal ash. So one way to kind of think about coal ash is if you're familiar with the old school method of grilling, where you took charcoal briquettes and threw them in your grill and burned them, you would notice that there was ash that would fly up out of the grill sometimes as you were cooking, and that's very similar to what we call fly ash. Fly ash is the ash that when you burn coal kind of starts to go up the stack. It's very light. And it's typically collected in a filter or a bag house of some sort or something called an electrostatic precipitator. It's collected that way. And then bottom ash is kind of like similar to what was left at the bottom of your barbecue grill once you were done cooking, the heavier stuff that fell to the bottom. And this is similar to what bottom ash is from a coal-fired boiler. It's the heavier portion of the ash that kind of sits in the bottom of the boiler after the coal is burned. There are also a couple other different types of waste products that involve ash. One is scrubber sludge, and this occurs at power plants that have desulfurization controls on their plants. And there's also this other category of ash called slag. But mainly we'll be kind of talking about fly ash and bottom ash. Those are the main two types of coal ash that we were looking at. So what do you do with the ash that's produced? So there's a lot that gets produced because a lot of coal has to be burned to produce electricity. So the ash again is the waste product, and utilities typically, depending on the type of boiler that they have, will manage their ash in kind of two different ways. One is kind of wet storage and disposal. They use water to sluice the ash from the boiler into a pond. And if you look at the image here, this is actually a plant in Missouri that we have a good aerial photo of. This is the Merrimack Power Plant in South St. Louis. It's actually been closed since this photo was taken. In the foreground, you see the Mississippi River. Behind that is a big pile of coal in the power plant. And then beyond that, those kind of lakey looking areas, those are surface impoundments or coal ash disposal ponds. And you can see it's very wet. There's actually water standing in them. Sometimes you don't see the water standing in them, but the ash itself is just saturated with water. So that's one form of coal ash storage and disposal. Another form is dry storage. This is an image of the Evergy Montrose plant down in kind of southwest Missouri. It's where the ash is instead of being sluiced, it's more or less pushed and then conveyed or carried to a landfill for dry disposal. So they don't use water to move it. They just kind of dump it into a landfill, similar to what you might see at a municipal solid waste landfill, and the ash just kind of piles up where it is. So some of the concerns about the disposal of ash come from the fact that the ash itself contains a lot of contaminants, including heavy metals, that can cause problems like contaminating groundwater. And that's one of the main concerns with the storage and disposal of coal ash, because for a long time it was essentially unregulated. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, meaning that it was just kind of managed haphazardly. So you see in this image, this is you can see the coal ash pond there next to the power plant where all the ash gets dumped. Oftentimes these, especially the surface impoundments, are older and they don't have good control methods to make sure that the ponds aren't leaking. Oftentimes they're dug deeper into the ground and they're unlined. So essentially there's nothing that prevents contaminants, things like arsenic, lithium, or boron from leaching out of the ponds and into the groundwater. And depending on how close the pond is to groundwater, it can cause those contaminants to make their way into groundwater, and that groundwater can flow into drinking water wells or also nearby water bodies like lakes or rivers. Coal-fired power plants typically are located on large bodies of water because they need lots of water for cooling purposes. So they tend to be very close to significant bodies of water like the Missouri or Mississippi rivers. So coal ash regulation. Up until 2015, there were no specific regulations for coal ash. Coal ash is one of the largest waste streams in the country, and it's a bit surprising that it took the EPA a very long time before they ever took notice of the problems that it could cause and began specifically regulating it. And that occurred in 2015 when EPA adopted regulations for the storage, management, and disposal of coal ash. Prior to that, it was kind of a haphazard regulation scheme. Each state may or may not be regulating coal ash disposal. Oftentimes, it was regulated through wastewater permits, which address the discharges that might be coming out of a coal ash pond or the runoff from a landfill. Um, the other way that they might have been regulated is through solid waste management permits. And again, so no regulation specific to coal ash, but they just kind of could have fallen under either one of those regulatory schemes on a kind of state by state basis. But um, by 2015, EPA had realized the hazards that coal ash posed, and they finalized regulations specific for coal ash. And these were pretty important regulations, and they imposed some significant requirements on owners and operators of coal ash disposal units. There were siting requirements related to the proximity of these units in relation to groundwater. The bottom of a pond or a landfill had to be at least 5 feet above the upper limits of the groundwater table. They couldn't be sited in certain seismic areas, and they couldn't be sited in wetlands. Um, they also imposed design requirements. As I mentioned, oftentimes these older ponds and landfills were not lined. EPA now requires that any new landfills or expansions of landfills or surface impoundments have specific liners designed to specific standards to help prevent leachate and leakage out of the disposal units. They also require regular inspections now. They require groundwater monitoring, which we're going to talk about a lot later in my presentation. Um, One thing that was also significant too is that the results of inspections, groundwater monitoring data, closure plans, things of that nature, all had to be published on publicly available websites that are run by the owners and operators of the impound or ash ponds and landfills. That was significant because then the public has immediate access to information about what's happening at the ponds and the landfills. So that was significant. The regulations also require closure of the ponds and landfills that are causing contamination. So the regulations, the EPA's federal regulations, were a big improvement over what had been going on prior to their implementation. And those regulations are the reason why we were able to do the research and work that we did in Iowa, because we have access to things like the groundwater monitoring data, which they have to post annually, and as well as their inspection reports. What did we do in Iowa? We took a look at these six utilities and their groundwater monitoring data that they had reported under the federal rule. So we looked at George Neal North, George Neal South, Walter Scott Jr., Louisa, Ottumwa, and Muscatine. These are the ones that we looked at. I'm going to go through a number of them, actually all of them, some in more detail than others, to kind of show exactly what we found. And I'm not going to lay out everything we found. That could take all night. But I'm just going to hit some of the highlights of what are the things that what are the problems, what are the issues that we found when we looked at the groundwater monitoring data. So we didn't get into, as I mentioned, they're required to do annual inspections of their disposal units. We're not going to get into anything related to those inspections, but our focus was mainly on the groundwater monitoring data. So every year since roughly 2016, these utilities have been annually posting their groundwater monitoring reports. Um, and in these reports, you'll see the groundwater monitoring network that the utilities set up. These networks consist of multiple wells um, that are sampled at least twice per year for certain pollutants that are associated with coal ash. Um, to try to determine if there's any leakage from the disposal units. The wells are both up gradient or what we call background. Also, those are kind of like what we would consider to be the clean um, wells that you can compare the down gradient wells to. The down gradient wells are the ones that are there and established to try to pick up contamination. So up gradient should be clean. Down gradient are the ones that are supposed to detect any contamination. And we also look for specific types of pollutants. There are a couple of pollutants in coal ash that are indicators. These contaminants are boron and sulfate. If because boron doesn't occur in high concentrations in the natural environment, if you find it in a monitoring well at significant concentrations, you almost are assured that you have a man-made source of pollution. And since you're monitoring next to an ash pond that contains ash that may have high levels of boron in it, then you're likely boron becomes a good indicator that your ash pond is leaking. Coal also typically contains uh, significant concentrations of sulfur. So if you're finding sulfate in your water or your groundwater, that's also a good indication that you've got a leak in your ash storage and disposal unit. Um, the the ash itself contains metals that are harmful to human health. The ones that we've kind of keyed on are arsenic, lithium. There are others as well. Cobalt, molybdenum, chromium. Those are some of the kind of the key ones that have health impacts that we would be worried about. So when we're looking at the groundwater monitoring data, we also have to be aware of certain things that influence the maybe influencing the groundwater data. One being the monitoring well location. So where did the utility site the well? How deep is it? Contaminants tend to move in plumes, and those plumes can be near the surface or at the top of the groundwater table, or they can sink in deeper into the groundwater table. So we need to look at the depth of the well the depth of the groundwater well to see how deep the water is being sampled. We also have to look at groundwater flow direction and speed. Some aquifers, groundwater moves incredibly slowly. A well that's drilled a groundwater monitoring well that's not near the coal ash disposal unit may not pick up contamination for literally for years because the groundwater moves so slow. That's generally not the case in Iowa because the most of the plants we looked at are located near large rivers. Those floodplain type aquifers tend to have groundwater that moves very fast. So you will, if a disposal unit is leaking, then the well should pick up contamination relatively quickly. The timing of the sampling is important. Other hydrologic factors can influence the flow of groundwater. So an aquifer that's in the floodplain of a large river like the Missouri or the Mississippi River, the groundwater will behave differently if that river is in drought stage compared to if that river is in flood stage. Flood stage tends to make the groundwater move away from the river. During droughts, the groundwater is moving directly towards the river. So those are things to be aware of. Also, soils and geology influence how and where the groundwater flows. Plus, we also have to be aware that there may be other sources of contamination. Typically, there's not a lot around a power plant. They're not located in highly populated areas. There doesn't tend to be a lot of other businesses located directly nearby, but we need to check to make sure that there aren't other potential sources of contamination as well. Um, so just as an example, here's an aerial photograph out of one of the groundwater monitoring reports for the George Neal North facility, and there's a lot going on in this image. But just to give you an idea of the things that can influence uh, groundwater. Um, so each of the labels that you see is next to a black round dot that may or may not be highlighted in a certain color, either purple or light blue, it looks like. Those are locations of groundwater monitoring wells. So as you can see, they're all over the site itself. Um, and so there's a lot of data to sift through because each one of those gets sampled twice a year. You'll also see to the lower left, you can kind of see the label that says Missouri. That's the Missouri River to the left. So obviously that's going to have an influence on the hydrology of the site. Um, the blue contour lines, uh, those are hydrologic gradient lines, similar to like topographic lines on a map you might see. These show the elevation of the groundwater, and based on that elevation, you can tell the direction of the groundwater flow. So if you see the big blue arrows there, those indicate in reading the groundwater contours, from low to high is the direction that groundwater flows. So as you can see here, the groundwater is flowing in multiple different directions. Some of the contours indicate flow towards the Missouri River, and some of them indicate flow away from the Missouri River. That flow is likely influenced by just the storage, the coal ash storage unit. There's a couple of landfills here as well as a surface impoundment that are now closed, but those things themselves are influencing the flow of the groundwater. Um,
Quick, quick question, Peter. And did you say these are on site at George Neal North? Like that thing in the upper left corner is the mountain of coal?
yes. Yeah. So this is an aerial photo out of their last groundwater monitoring report. The upper left is the pile of coal at the plant. And you can't see them very well, but there's some labels there that show they refer to the landfills as monofills. There's a monofill west cell, a monofill east cell, and then up closer towards the top, there's several surface impoundments that were up there that are now closed. Um, so here's a little bit clearer picture. This is at Walter Scott Jr. Energy Center. But this shows kind of the locations of groundwater monitoring wells. There's two surface impoundments here. You can see the energy center and the mountain of coal to the left, kind of in the middle there, surrounded by the red dashed and dotted line. On the upper part is the north surface impoundment. The lower part is the south surface impoundment. This looks like this image was taken when those impoundments were being closed. But again, the black dots surrounding those impoundments are where the groundwater monitoring wells are located. Um, to the to the right of the photo, there are some monitoring wells that are a bit distant from the impoundments themselves. I think those are some of the background or upgradient monitoring wells where they're collecting or supposedly clean groundwater up there. So you can kind of see how a monitoring network might be laid out. Oftentimes the wells are just located around the edges of the storage units and disposal units themselves. So I'm going to go through some of the units that we looked, or some of the plants that we looked at. So George Neal North Energy Center, it's a fairly sizable 550 megawatt generating unit, has four coal ash ponds. We just saw the aerial photo. That was the one that had the hydraulic contours on it. And it has a landfill, although the site lists, they kind of classify the landfill as one unit, even though there's kind of separate cells within that unit. The monitoring network has 39 total groundwater monitoring wells, so a good number of wells. And in going through their monitoring data, and we went through, I forget how many years of data we'll show on the next slide, but we found elevated concentrations of arsenic, cobalt, and lithium. Um, so here's a graph that we put together kind of showing the contamination levels for arsenic. There's basically three lines here. The blue line is basically what the standard is, and that standard is the MCL, also known as the maximum contaminant level or drinking water standard for arsenic, which is 0.01 milligrams per liter or 10 micrograms per liter. So the blue line represents the standard. And then we looked at the average concentration across the monitoring network for arsenic. So if you look at those averages, they are above, and in some cases, like in year 2021, the average was roughly twice the standard. We also looked at the maximum concentration. So these are single sample maximums that occurred in that 1 year. So if we found a very high level at one well, and we listed that as the maximum, that's the number that you'll see here. And that helps us not miss some of the kind of the hotspot areas that might be occurring across the monitoring network. So some wells might consist, because of the direction the groundwater flows, might show consistently kind of low levels of arsenic, whereas other ones that might be in the kind of in the plume of contamination, you'd see spikes in arsenic, and they consistently show high levels. So that's kind of what the maximum shows, is if we're finding high concentrations in one area that's being monitored. So as you see very high levels of arsenic over 0.1 milligrams per liter, which is roughly 10 times the drinking water standard for arsenic. So that's fairly significant. We have seen higher in other places, but that's a high level of arsenic, and everybody's probably familiar with arsenic being a severe health risk for people. So this is kind of I mean, obviously this is an indication that their disposal units for their ash are leaking, and certainly you don't want to have high levels of arsenic in your groundwater, but this is a good indication that there's a problem there at George Neal North. Of course, we also looked at George Neal South, which is, as the name implied, just south of George Neal North. Also has a sizable generating unit, 640 megawatts. There's a landfill there. The landfill was closed in 2018, much like the storage or disposal units at George Neal North that are closed. It has 52 total groundwater monitoring wells. And again, here we found elevated concentrations of lithium and arsenic. So here's another graph similar to the previous graph. This one just happens to be for lithium. So the lithium, and I should point out that the standards we're referring to often differ because they come from different sources. So as I said, the arsenic was a drinking water standard. The federal coal ash rule actually establishes a specific standard for lithium because there is no drinking water standard specifically established for lithium. So the standard for lithium is 0.04 milligrams per liter, 40 micrograms per liter. And again, you could see high average concentration across the monitoring well network for lithium, and then the spikes from certain wells, the maximum, which is the red line there, you can see high levels of lithium, three or more times the actual standard in the federal CCR rule. And I'm sorry, CCR also stands for coal combustion residuals. It's another shorthand for coal ash. So I apologize if I didn't mention that earlier, but if you see CCR, it also means coal ash. Um, then we looked at Walter Scott Jr. Energy Center. This is a pretty big plant, two generating units, 690 megawatts and 790 megawatts. Has a landfill and two inactive coal ash ponds, 39 total monitoring wells for the ponds, an additional 29 wells for the landfill. Um, in the monitoring network for the ash ponds, we found elevated concentrations for boron and sulfate. Again, remember those are good indicators for coal ash contamination. And then at the landfill, we also found elevated concentrations of arsenic. So here's the data for around the ash ponds. Obviously, the sulfate levels are fairly high. There's not a specific standard for sulfate, but typical background levels for sulfate are going to be less than 100 milligrams per liter. So if you start finding concentrations above 200 or more, then then you likely have some contamination. As you can see, again, the spikes in sulfate at certain wells are quite high. The red line being well up over 1,000. And again, for boron, like I said, boron does not occur in high concentrations in the natural environment. So if you're finding concentrations of boron above zero point 0.1 milligrams per liter, you've got some sort of contamination going on. And here, the the spikes are fairly high, over 5 milligrams per liter. That's not natural by any means. That's a good indication that the coal ash ponds are leaking. There's no national standard for boron. Some states have, I don't believe Iowa has a state standard. Missouri has a groundwater standard for boron of 2 milligrams per liter. The World Health Organization recommends a standard of 2.4 to protect human health. Um, Let me go back here real quick. Again, the average is while it's not above that WHO standard, it is definitely above any natural background levels. And again, the spikes are pretty high for boron. Okay, so moving on to Interstate Power and Light's Ottumwa generating station. This one is located along the Des Moines River. It has a couple of ash ponds. The ponds are currently closed. Here we found some elevated concentrations of lithium and cobalt. Cobalt is kind of unique. We don't always find high concentrations of that, but we did find some of that here. We did find the contamination is a bit widespread. So there's contamination at wells near the pond. There was a well that was situated fairly far away from the plant and down gradients close to the river that did show significant contamination too. So that was fairly unique. There was really only one well that was farther away from the disposal ponds, and it did show contamination at it. So I think that's significant for the Ottumwa plant that there's a plume of contamination that's not just restricted to the area around the plant, but is moving farther away from the plant. Based on the groundwater flow, it's moving towards the Des Moines River and likely into the Des Moines River. So here's a couple of graphs here. We have a little bit more data on these. For lithium, again, the standard is these are in micrograms per liter. apologize for switching units on you here. So the standard is 40 micrograms per liter or 0.04 milligrams per liter. That's the horizontal blue line. The green line represents the average across the monitoring network. The red is again the maximum concentrations or the spikes we might see at certain wells. And then the blue line there, we added in data from the background monitoring wells too. So you can kind of see that the background monitoring wells are below the 40 microgram per liter standard. The average across the monitoring network seems to be increasing over time, which is concerning. And then the spikes are really, really high. You're at almost 300 micrograms per liter, and again, the standard is 40. So you're probably 8 or so times the standard. So that's concerning too. Cobalt as well, we kind of see the same thing. The background wells or the upgradient wells are pretty clean, not showing much in the way of cobalt. But then the mean is pretty close to the standard, which is, sorry, I should mention this earlier, but the standard for cobalt is 5 micrograms per liter. Um, and then the maximums are well above that standard, hitting 20 and in some cases over 60 micrograms per liter. So that's pretty significant. Um, a couple other ones that we looked at. We looked at Louisa. It has a couple landfills and an ash pond. There are 22 groundwater monitoring wells in its network. Um, we've found some high concentrations of sulfate and also some concerning spikes in radium. So sulfates, again, as you can see, um, the background and are low, are relatively low. The mean across the site um, is a little bit above background. The maximums, kind of maybe in some good news, appear to be declining. So that might be good. Going back to the radium, I didn't put a graph up for this. There were a couple samples that tested very high for radium over a couple year period. And these were unique to one well and unique in that the spikes only occurred over a couple years. It's concerning that they happened, but I don't know if there's a good explanation for why those spikes occurred and then everything kind of went back to normal. And then Muscatine. Muscatine is located on the Mississippi River. It's relatively close to Louisa. It has a landfill, and we found very high concentrations of both boron and sulfate. Again, good indicators for coal ash. We have on this chart, we have background levels, and then means and maximums. Again, remember that we don't have the WHO standard on here, but that standard was 2.4. So the mean at this site across the network is almost twice the recommendation for the WHO. So very high concentrations of boron, and you can see the spikes there of almost 20 milligrams per liter. That's just exceptionally high. And same thing for sulfate. Background tends to be low, and then the mean and the spikes across the down gradient wells show pretty high concentrations. So clearly something's happening at Muscatine as well too. There's leakage, there's contamination, just based on the data that we looked at. So those were the 6 sites that we looked at. So conclusions are basically Iowa's like every other state that has a lot of coal ash disposal units that are somewhat old. There's contamination. You look at a surface impoundment or a landfill that's been around for a little while anywhere in the country, and you're likely going to find some contamination. And Iowa was no different in the six units that we looked at. And again, we found high levels of boron, sulfate, arsenic, lithium, cobalt, that are in excess of federal standards, and just kind of goes to show that, oftentimes people, the public thinks of coal-fired power plants as large sources of air pollution, and they most certainly are. But they're also contaminating the environment in other ways. In this case, their coal ash disposal methods are inadequate, and they are causing groundwater problems in Iowa, just like they are in Missouri or Texas or any place else. Um, so that kind of wraps up my presentation. Be happy to answer questions if people have them.
Oh my gosh, I didn't think we'd have enough time to cover all of it, honestly.
So I went through that pretty fast.
Um, it's awesome though. I'm gonna link while you guys are thinking of some questions. I'm gonna drop a link in the chat to a folder where these fact sheets are accessible, so folks can look at them directly and access them later. I'll also include it in a follow-up email. And while I'm unmuted, I know one question I get a lot, and I don't know if you can answer this because I don't know if your research necessarily covered this, but folks always ask, how many ash sites are there in Iowa?
How many ash sites are there in Iowa? That's a good question. I don't know the total number, but I could look it up real quick if you wanted me to. So we looked at six of them. Sorry, I'm gonna have to pull this up on another screen. We looked up at six. There are more, and there's also EPA. As I mentioned, the utilities are required to post their groundwater monitoring reports as well as other reports on a public accessible website. And EPA, at least at the moment, still has a nice handy page that you can click on any state on a map, and it will take you to the list of um, utilities with coal ash disposal sites, and their publicly available information. So there's one, two, three. I count 13 sites in Iowa, and those probably don't include or may not include. I'm going to caveat it a little bit. So there's a category of disposal sites that's called legacy coal ash disposal sites, and those are coal ash disposal ash ponds or landfills that are at coal-fired power plants that were closed prior to 2015. So originally, EPA exempted those for reasons that don't make any sense to me, as well as a lot of other people, as well as and the court system. So for some reason, EPA exempted those. So if it was at a power plant that shut down prior to 2015, EPA said that the rule doesn't apply to them, which doesn't make a lot of sense because, if a plant shut down in 2014 and had an ash pond there that was old and leaking, then, why aren't they being required to do groundwater monitoring and report and close the pond in compliance with the federal rules? It doesn't make any sense, and that issue was actually litigated, and EPA has proposed to cover those ponds. I can't remember if that's been that part of the regulation has been finalized yet, but there may be some of those out there in Iowa. I'm not familiar with those in Iowa. I know there's a couple in Missouri that are like that.
Okay, so you said 13 active then? Is that
13 active plants.
okay, cool. I fear
Yeah.
of like the inactive ones with yeah, that's crazy. Like potentially decades of waste within them, up until 2014. So terrifying. We have a couple questions coming in. So One of them is these levels are outrageous over the years. Is anything being done by the owners of the ash site, so Mid-American and IPL in these cases, and Muscatine Power and Water?
Mhm.
Do they have any actual reason to do anything?
So they're supposed to do something. And usually when they detect contamination, they generally have to close the disposal unit. So if they find contamination, they're required to stop putting ash in it. And then they usually close the disposal unit. So there's two ways that they can be closed. One is by um, actually removing the ash from the unit and then putting it in a safer disposal unit, one that has a liner in it, one that's hopefully not leaking. Um, the other way, and the most popular way that they close the pond, is by capping it, which means that they leave the ash in place and then they put a cover, they grade off the top of it, and they usually put a cover on of a couple feet of soil plus like a geomembrane to prevent water infiltrating the unit. The problem with that is that oftentimes that doesn't stop the leaching. It prevents like stormwater and rain from getting in, but it doesn't stop contamination from leaching out of the bottom. It may reduce it somewhat, but that's typically how they're addressing, most utilities are addressing the contamination problem. Is their first step is, well, we'll just close it, put a cap on it, and hope that makes everything better. And in most cases, it might show a slight improvement, but I haven't seen anything, at least in the Midwest, that indicates that just closing um, uh, a former impoundment or landfill without doing anything else reduces the contamination.
Thank you.
Sure.
Um, and I will just add to that we can also make them do things. We can
Well,
yeah, which I'll come back to that at the end.
sure.
In some cases. So another question is how much coal ash in Iowa is recycled for various industry use and how much are being disposed? Is that something you know,
Um,
Peter?
I don't know. I don't know. So the reuse or recycling, as they call it, falls under a term called beneficial reuse or beneficial use. It's where they take coal ash and find another use for it other than just dumping it into a landfill or an ash pond. Some sort of use that is supposed to not allow the contaminants to leach from it. It's oftentimes added to concrete. It can be used in drywall, um, other things like that. So a fair amount can be diverted from just dumping it in a landfill or a pond that way, but the vast majority of it just gets disposed of. There are also some things that utilities have claimed as beneficial use that aren't really beneficial use. Things like using it as fill material. So if you need to fill in a site because you want to construct something on it, using it for fill material instead of soil or something like that. The 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 ash in that case is unencapsulated and water can still come in contact with it and you can still get leaching. So that's not really beneficial use. It's also used as and I don't know that it's been done in Missouri, although I'm guessing it probably has, but it's also can be used as a soil amendment on cropland. Um, there is some nutrient content to it. So I guess it can be applied as almost like a fertilizer, but it also has all these nasty other things in it, like arsenic and cobalt and stuff that I wouldn't want applied to any field that I was growing any food on. So um, I think that's allowed by EPA, but I wouldn't consider that a beneficial reuse.
Yeah, I guess beneficial is subjective there. Um, I
Yes.
definitely heard that in some sort of gardening space, and wood is different, but from fireplaces, taking your ash from there and like putting it for your flowers to grow. But also, most people aren't eating their flowers, so
Yeah.
um, and much smaller scale. So not
Yeah.
advocating for it, but
No.
interesting. Okay, one other question is, can these contaminants be removed in urban water treatment plants?
Um, they can be. So they can end up in the sludge of your wastewater treatment plant. If the water is um, if you have a contamination source that gets pumped through a wastewater treatment plant, that would be probably really expensive. And I'm not sure how effective it would be because I don't know what the effectiveness of the kind of like the percent reduction you would get by running it through a wastewater treatment plant. There are processes that can be used to remove contaminants. One of our utilities here, Ameren, Missouri, is running a kind of a pump and treat system at the Rush Island power plant, which just closed last year, where they've drilled wells into the or near the pond itself, and they suck out groundwater, run it through a treatment system, and then repump the groundwater back into the aquifer to basically remove contaminants um, at uh, at that site. We've looked at some of the preliminary data in their groundwater monitoring reports. It doesn't appear to be particularly effective in reducing concentrations across the entire site. The data itself, they are actually removing contaminants, but just not enough and at a rate that would actually clean up the aquifer beneath their ash pond. At least from the little bit of data that we've seen, they've just started operating it a couple of years ago.
Interesting. Thank you. So one other common question I've gotten over the years is whether people can or should check if they're on a well themselves in these areas, how that can be monitored, if they should test their water for these. Obviously, they test for other reasons and
Mhm.
contaminants.
Yeah, so if you live near one of these plants, the nice thing about having all this data publicly available is that you can kind of look up where the plant is, where their monitoring wells are, and see the results of those wells. And also, like I said, they have these maps that show the direction of groundwater flow. So if I lived near one of these plants and I looked at the maps and saw that the groundwater was flowing in the direction of my private well, and also that the plant or that the results of the monitoring was showing some contamination, I would be concerned and probably want to test my well. If I was shown to be like, hydrologically up gradient or far enough away from the plant, then it's probably less of a concern. But if I lived near it, and then showed, and their data showed that there was contamination, and that contamination could potentially be flowing in the direction of my well, I would likely want to have it tested. The problem, I would say the problem, but testing is not inexpensive. So you would probably need to contact the uh, trying to remember the name of the environmental agency that regulates drinking water in Iowa. Is it Iowa DNR?
Sorry, I was Googling. Yeah,
Yeah,
the Department of Natural Resources.
Iowa Department of Natural Resources. So they could probably point you in the direction um, of a lab that can do that sort of testing, and you could get a test kit and pull samples yourself and drop them off at a lab and have them tested. Again, the cost is it's not going to be cheap to do it, but um, if I were concerned that I were in the pathway of a contamination plume, then I would be inclined to do it.
Okay, so one other just kind of anecdotal question. I'm trying to picture these wells because I've been around these
Mhm.
pole plants quite a few times. Are they just kind of poles in the ground? I was looking up some photos and they just kind of look very nondescript.
It looks like somebody stuck a pipe in the ground. if they've done the installation right, depending on where the well is, there should be some markers around it. Oftentimes, when they install wells that are going to be more or less permanent, they'll put up some concrete bollards around it so that nobody backs it over it with a bulldozer or
Yeah.
backs their tractor over it or something along those lines. So people knows it there, but it essentially looks like a pipe that sticks a couple, maybe 3 feet out of the ground, um, and it's capped on top. And it should have a well marker number on it, and be pretty easily visible, like I said, so that somebody doesn't actually accidentally damage it, um, if they don't know it's there. But yeah, they're pretty nondescript.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, we are about at time here. If there's any other questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or in the chat, or email me afterwards, and we can try and get those answered for you. I do want to share a link to an article that came out not long ago. When was this? Putting it in the chat now, back in February, just under a month ago, on Valentine's Day. So this was some reporting on the ash disposal at the mostly Mid-American coal plants, and sites are research and us. I have a funny quote in there. Check it out. I think it's especially funny. Mid-American accuses us of cherry picking, but it's their data and ripe for the picking. So not our fault they planted those seeds. So please give that article a read if you haven't already. And then I also want to share another fun, well, not fun, but I mean, legal avenue we are taking to pursue this. Yesterday, we, Sierra Club, in partnership with our partners at ELPC, Environmental Law and Policy Center, and Iowa Environmental Council, notified Alliant Energy, IPL, of our intent to sue for unpermitted discharges of polluted groundwater that's pumped out from under an Ottumwa coal ash landfill. So this letter, which is required before filing suit under the Clean Water Act, allows 60 days for the discharger, IPL, to come into compliance, or for the state to begin enforcement action. So their IPL's discharge has polluted this groundwater site has polluted groundwater from the site for decades, I think since 95. The discharge was covered under a state-issued stormwater permit. However, the Iowa DNR informed IPL in 2023 that the discharge did not qualify under the permit due to the presence of arsenic and other toxic pollutants. IPL has neither stopped the discharge nor applied for a new permit to allow the discharge. And so continuing to discharge these pollutants, which is arsenic, and other heavy metals, is a violation of the Clean Water Act. So this is exciting. It's awful, but we are putting the pressure on and not going to stand for this. It's terrible news for the people of Southeast Iowa, for everybody downstream, really. So excited to share that with you and want to tell you to stay tuned for more in the future. And yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm going to share a press release we have on it with a little bit more information. And I will drop that in the chat as well. This is big, very fresh news. Sorry, one sec. All the links, all the tabs. There you go. All right, cool. Well, thank you again so much, Peter. This has been really awesome. I know I've gotten a lot of questions on this research over the last couple of months, and I'm really excited for you to have presented all of this. And it's a great opportunity for our partners and our members to learn more. So thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.